It's another Friday, and that means another edition live of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. Every week, you know the drill, because you're right here with us. I'm John, my son Jeremy, and we're going to take on the issues of the day and the issues of the world. How you doing?
I'm good. I can't wait.
Okay, good. All right, so here's what I just came up with. There was a press release this week, and the headline, Doomsday Clock set at 90 seconds to midnight. I think many people are familiar with the fact that the Bureau of Atomic Scientists puts this out every year. But this year, particularly alarming. Here's what they said, part of the news release. Doomsday Clock was set at 90 seconds to midnight, due largely but not exclusively to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the increased risk of nuclear escalation. The new clock time was also influenced by continuing threats posed by the climate crisis, the breakdown of global norms, and institutions needed to mitigate risks associated with advancing technologies and biological threats such as COVID-19. So with that said, obviously, so they're talking about threats in Russia, but we read this week supporting that Russia and Germany are bilaterally going at each other. Germany having agreed to send 51 tanks to Ukraine, with Germany now in the hot seat. We read also that the Scandinavian countries are on high alert. Italy is on high alert, and the United States, of course, the question is, are we edging towards some sort of NATO further involvement as we announced that we would be delivering drones and tanks as well? Headlines on Drudge appear that folks are talking about it. I'm not talking in conspiracy circles, but folks among policymakers talking about the real potential of World War III. But then we go further and we look at Israel, which is by many accounts on the verge of a civil war. Let's say at the very least, the brand new government, the fifth, incidentally, in 4 years, is on the brink of collapsing, as one cabinet member was ordered by the Israeli Supreme Court to step down. That threatens Netanyahu's majority. But we also see that within Israel, there's that continuing battle, although very acute these days, over the heart and soul of the nation. Without going into details, really the unprecedented in recent decades treatment of Palestinians, more importantly, Palestinian rights and Palestinian issues. Okay, we go from there, and the coalition is formed between Israel and major Gulf oil-producing companies in what I think can only be described as an anti-Iran coalition, which does not bode well if we're talking about World War III. That's a flashpoint, as is China and its expansion and its declaration of control over the South China Sea and that area, Southeast Asia in the Pacific, reminding one of Japan and its East Asia co-prosperity sphere on the verge of World War II. And so we get at all of these all at once. We're concerned about the breakdown of democracy in this country and in other countries as well. How stable are the democratic governments and democratic movements throughout the West? And then you say to yourself, what's this all got to do with the price of eggs? I don't know, but the price of eggs is just outrageous right now, and that's not going very well either. And so we, in short, have a lot to worry about here. Okay, I just laid that all on you.
Yeah.
Help me out.
Well, I mean, I can't, I'm not going to be able to, in 20 minutes, touch on everything. But the things that are important, first of all, we need to address, and you hit on this, the comments that were made by the foreign minister in Germany the other day. I believe the woman's name is Ms. Braddock. Braddock. I'm not exactly saying her name correctly, but she said, in short, we are at war with Russia. Now, a year ago, folks would not have necessarily been aware of that. They would have thought this was supporting the Ukrainians for the Russian invasion. But we've been accustomed with this war in Ukraine now for a year, where I think the cat is out of the bag. It's not as much about the Ukrainians, it's about the Russians. And I can say that because I have watched, having lived in Europe back in 2007 and 8, when there was a major transition. Remember, during the Bush years, as early as 2005, after he got reelected, there was that famous meeting between George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, where he said, we were on a boat, he went to Russia, and I looked into his soul, he said. And there was talk about Russia joining NATO. There was talk about Russia getting along with the United States. In fact, by and large, they were getting along. Then something happened around 2007, 2008. More and more countries on the border of Russia were being recruited into NATO. And what Putin became aware of was that was a trend that wasn't going to reverse. And so one by one, military bases, countries that are being drawn into NATO, military bases being built on the border. And it was made very clear in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, where on day one, the United States made overtures to Georgia, the nation of Georgia, and to Ukraine, come on in NATO. Putin showed up on day two and said, no, absolutely not. That's where I draw the line. And so now here we are in a situation where Western Ukraine has been heavily armed with lethal weaponry and foreign aid. And by the way, I mentioned this before, it's worth mentioning again. If you want to talk about a nation of kleptocracy, Ukraine is the epitome of kleptocracy. It is a government run by kleptocrats. A report came out the other day that generals and high-level people were caught stealing from the funds, benefiting from the funds. We're talking about billions of dollars in taxpayers' money, while you talk about the price of eggs and people watching their income dwindle as inflation goes up. And we are, in effect, sending money to a corrupt government where there is a struggle between Western Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians. Eastern Ukrainians who identify as Russian, Western Ukrainians who identify more as Western, and all we can think about is Ukraine is one nation. Ukraine is actually two nations. And the United States has fostered that division. They should have never gotten involved in Ukraine. I say Ukraine is the last stronghold in the eyes of Russia. Leave it alone, stay out of there, because that will bring us to World War III. As corrupt as the Kremlin is, and we know that, the fact of the matter is they have stood by for nearly 20 years as they have watched their border become encircled by NATO military bases, as we ensure them, no, it's not to do with you. It is everything to do with Russia. Russia was pulled into this invasion by the lethal funding of Kiev to the Kiev government. And the last thing I'll say about Ukraine is that you have to understand the reason why there's this obsession with taking out Russia is because we are still ruled by neoconservatives. Neoconservatives who set our agenda, our foreign policy agenda during the George W. Bush years, made their way into the Obama cabinet and haven't quite left. They're still very powerful. And the neoconservative agenda wants to get rid of Russia, literally see them split into several nations and have them collapsed, because Russia's role in the world is part of what's known as the Belt Road Initiative, the Silk Road 2.0. And that's where the Eurasian continent comes together and they build up and modernize their infrastructure. And that is a threat to American dominance. That is a threat to Pax Americana. So what this really is something that's shaping up to be like, in Orwell's 1984, Eurasia versus Oceania versus Atlantica, only it's really two axes. It's the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia that want to build a future where they are bigger players, and the West is afraid of being left out. Now, I just want to say one other thing, because this is something that missed out in the news. When the World Economic Forum last week held their big meeting, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, said that he is interested. Remember that the world runs on the dollar system.
Yeah.
Every nation that has to buy oil has to hold dollars to purchase oil from OPEC nations. MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, is now saying he's calling that into question, removing what is known as the petrodollar system, and that he would be interested in taking payment from Chinese yuan for oil. And what that does is that throws the whole global economy that's currently, dominated by the dollar into disarray. That is actually the biggest news. And I think that that's an interesting backdrop to this World War III, because oftentimes what we see in major world conflicts is a currency losing its status.
Okay. A lot of what you say is legitimate, especially the constant theme and paranoia in Russian history. But back to Putin, does he not bear any responsibility for this?
If you read the influential paper, Unbalancing and Overextending Russia, by the Rand Corporation, written in 2019, you see that there was a strategy. And one of the scenarios that they laid out was to provide lethal arms to Kiev, because when the current government,
meaning the United States, NATO,
through NATO, but mainly
yes.
Lockheed, Raytheon, and Boeing, and all the tanks that we're talking about today. When the current, so in 2014, the Ukrainian parliament was dominated by a Russian-backed government. They were ousted, and then a pro-Western government came to power. That pro-Western government made immediately in effect a law banning the Russian language. Understand that half of Ukraine historically speaks Russian. And when they banned the language, which the Eastern Ukrainians, who are largely Russian, they were fearful. And immediately Kiev started bombing these regions because they decided that they were going to break away from that.
But is there no Russian imperialism and a sense among Ukrainians, particularly Western Ukrainians, that this is an expression of nationalism and legitimacy as an independent nation?
Well, before we get to that, do we call it imperialism as NATO grows and we no longer have a Cold War? I mean, we do now, again, but throughout the 90s, we didn't have a Cold War. Throughout the early 2000s, we didn't have a Cold War. Why was NATO growing?
Does this justify Russian brutality?
Well, I think we need to take into account. See, this is the battle of narratives right now.
Yeah.
One side says Russian brutality.
Yeah, and we're trying to inform.
Yeah. But what if you begin to understand that Russia was drawn into the war? That if you have a situation where on the Canadian border, Russians are interfering into the politics of Ukraine and funding the opposition, and an opposition party comes to power that says, yeah, we want you to build a naval base in the Hudson Bay or whatever, would we not say that there's aggression going on there and that we're being threatened? That's the exact situation that Russia is facing.
But targeting hospitals, targeting schools, targeting apartment buildings, targeting senior service centers, targeting, not the military speak of collateral damage.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard reports that say the opposite. And I know, this can be considered. We know that in war, there's propaganda. Were you in '68 when you came out against the Vietnam War, or '67? Were you getting the truth about what was going on?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, in early
there weren't the mechanisms back then to get the. Yeah, I.F. Stone was around.
In the Iraq War. Were we getting the truth? We were told that we had to go in there because there was weapons of mass destruction.
But we have video. We have video evidence that can't all be manipulated.
But there are interesting sources who have said that. I mean, look. We don't know. We only know what we're told. But if you understand that Russian and Ukrainians have a Slavic brotherhood, and that many Ukrainians are of Russian descent, that you could easily make the argument Russians don't want to do this, but when you have the meddling of the affairs on their border and from their perspective, it becomes a national security threat that this war in Ukraine is really about checkmate Russia. Look, I think that they bought the bait. I think I don't know. I don't know what they should do. What I know is that what I believe is if we were to withdraw all of our funding and we were to stay, had we never gotten involved in this, nothing would have happened.
All right, so ask me the main question of the day.
I don't know. What is it?
Dad, what do you think?
What do you think?
Okay. I go back to 1965. Barry Maguire. We're on the eve of destruction. And I look at the Doomsday Clock, regardless of what one may think of the Doomsday Clock and the folks behind it, fact of the matter is that folks are talking about World War III.
Yeah.
They're talking about it in Europe. They're talking about it in the Middle East. We know because we're in touch, starting to talk about it here as well, despite our, quote, splendid isolation from the other half of the world. And what troubles me is, regardless of the causes and regardless of the other things, positive things that may be going on in our lives, this is a point where I haven't heard talk about World War III as seriously as this since the 1950s.
Yeah.
Too many flashpoints.
Yeah.
I'm troubled by the lack of institutions, both domestic and global institutions, that are prepared to deal with this. And I'm also worried about the technology that can start it at the snap of a finger.
Yeah.
Whether it's cyber technology, military technology, biotechnology, or whatever. And so I'm still the optimist. A lot of good may come out of this, just as it did after World War II. Although a lot of evil came out of World War II as well. But I think we have cause to be troubled. Last word, go ahead.
Okay, so two things. And I don't know if it's still on the State Department's website, but the American Embassy in Ukraine was making it public that there were bio-research weapons labs in Ukraine, funded by the United States Department.
That was on the State Department website?
Yes. And now what they say, it was research to prevent, biological attacks. But from a Russian perspective, if there are State Department funded bio labs, what do you think that they're going to interpret that as? And what intelligence do they have? Now, that's just a question.
Can I ask you a favor?
Yeah.
Since you've seen it,
Yeah.
check to see if it's there, and if it's there, will you post the link?
I think
If you
people.
can.
No, I mean, I think people should just look If I can remember, bioweapons threat reduction program. So you just Google. I don't want to post this stuff on our site. People could look it up on Google. And so there's that. My question to you: when you ask me a challenging question, and it kind of puts me in a corner. You say all this Russian brutality. Should they? Of course, I don't want to see brutality. Of course, I don't. But my question to those folks who only started to become aware of the Ukrainian issue in February of 2022, my question to you is, for 6 to 8 years prior, the United States, through Washington, D.C., were funding Kiev to bomb eastern Ukraine. This went on for 6 to 8 years, causing a humanitarian crisis. Are you in favor of that? Do you support that? Had you known that, would you have supported that? Would you have supported a regime that moved to ban a language that has been spoken in that country for centuries? Are you in support of that? Are you aware of some of the battalions and the iconography that they use that are far right-wing and even outright Nazi? Are you aware that they have been trained by NATO? Do you support that? This is stuff that has been clearly going on since 2014 and is well documented. But if you jump into the news cycle in February of 2022, it looks a lot different. If you go back to 2014, you get a whole different picture, and you start to see why the Russians were drawn into this, because a major humanitarian catastrophe was happening on their border.
That's the last word.
And all of this fits into the context of this, why scientists are saying we're 90 seconds to midnight. This is my closing word. I am not in support of America. I'm not in support of Russia. I'm not in support of Ukraine. I am in support of a peaceful resolution that, instead of talking about foreign aid and weaponry, we need to say, I'm sending an envoy there right now, John Kerry, to talk with Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov. And we need to hammer out a situation where maybe there's a partition, where the agreement is the Eastern Ukraine goes to Russia, Western Ukraine becomes a neutral, NATO-free zone. That would divert this. Is anybody interested in that?
Okay. So, simple question to everybody out there. Are we, humanity, 90 seconds before midnight? Is the Doomsday Clock accurately set this year? Please let us know. It could be a lightning round. Just yes or no to that question only. Thanks. We'll be back next week.